Dorothy, the Wicked Witch, the Tin Man, Ruby Slippers, Toto, Oz. These are just a handful of the words that have become synonymous with the 1939 classic, The Wizard of Oz. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you're more than likely aware of it on some level through cultural osmosis, as the film has touched virtually every form of entertainment. It's been spoofed countless times, has prominently appeared in theme parks, and led to additional adaptations of the book series it was based on, although some much more disturbing than others. But while the movie is revered as a cinematic masterpiece, it's also infamous for its disastrous production problems, possibly more than any other film in history. From all the failed attempts that came before it, when production had to start over, its 5 different directors, on-set disasters, forever lost footage, you name it. So let's take a deep dive into the making of a movie which somehow, despite the universe clearly working against it, was even produced at all, with the disastrous production history of The Wizard of Oz. Our story begins in the year 1900 with the publication of L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The book itself had humble beginnings, and was essentially the culmination of made-up fantasy stories the author would tell his children and their friends. However, there was no one singular source of inspiration for these wondrous tales, and if anything was simply the result of his, let's say, diverse career path. This includes his time as a traveling salesman, as an actor, a playwright, a chicken breeder, the owner of a general store, an Axle lubricant vendor, and more. But there are specific influences that tie directly to Oz, such as the fear of a scarecrow in his dreams as a child, and a tin man he constructed during his time as a window shop dresser. Another was his visit to the extravagant 1883 Chicago World's Fair, which would serve as inspiration for the Emerald City. It's also said that the name Oz itself came from a filing cabinet in his office where he worked, with a drawer labeled O through Z. So with the collaboration of an illustrator named W. Denslow, L. Frank Baum poured all of his ideas onto paper and let his imagination flow, to create The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Now for those who have never read the original book, let's briefly cover the basic elements of the story with the original illustrations. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz focused on the adventure of Dorothy Gale, who lives on a farm in Kansas with her Auntie Em, Uncle Henry, and her dog Toto. One day she and her house are swept up into a tornado, and she winds up in the magical land of Oz, or more specifically Munchkin Land. There she meets the Good Witch of the North, who informs her that she set the Munchkins free by killing the Wicked Witch of the East. To Dorothy's shock, it turns out that her house landed right on top of the Munchkins' former evil ruler, and Dorothy is gifted the witch's pair of, in this version, magical silver shoes. With the Munchkins set free, Dorothy's advised to go see the powerful Wizard of Oz in the Emerald City, as he's the only one who can send her back home. So she goes off to see the wizard, but she's never actually told to follow the yellow brick road, only that the road to the Emerald City is paved in yellow brick. In fact, nowhere in the book is it ever called the Yellow Brick Road, just variations of the term. Anyway, as Dorothy travels to the Emerald City, she meets the Scarecrow, who wishes he had a brain, the Tin Man, who wishes he had a heart, and the Cowardly Lion, who wishes for courage. Although in this version the Tin Man's backstory is especially bizarre, which has to do with a munchkin he was once in love with whose mother cursed him to prevent their marriage. He then proceeded to accidentally chop off all of his body parts one by one, which were then replaced by tin from a tinsmith, and is why he wants a heart, to be able to love again. Anyway, they all decide to join Dorothy in going to see the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and have a few perilous side adventures along the way. Now oddly enough, in the original version the Emerald City isn't actually green. It turns out that the city is so incredibly bright due to its brilliance that everybody who lives there has to wear green-tinted spectacles, otherwise they'd go blind. The group of outsiders then meet with the Wizard of Oz individually, where he takes on different forms such as a floating head, a ferocious beast, and a beautiful woman. Eventually they're told he'll grant their wishes if, and only if, they kill the Wicked Witch of the West, the last remaining Wicked Witch in the land of Oz. This is when the witch makes her first appearance in the book, well over halfway through, and sends her flying monkeys to capture Dorothy and her friends. However, within just a few pages when she's held captive at the witch's castle, Dorothy accidentally throws a bucket of water at the witch, which causes the Wicked Witch to melt before her very eyes. Now in this version it's established that the witch's flying monkeys are good guys, but bound by a golden cap with magical powers, which grants 3 wishes to whoever puts it on. So after Dorothy defeats the Wicked Witch, she uses her first wish to be taken back to the Emerald City, where the group hopes to be rewarded by the wizard. Unfortunately, they discover that the Wizard of Oz is a fraud, and is simply a guy who came to Oz by way of a hot air balloon, and was able to convince its citizens he was a powerful wizard. But he still gives the companions a special token to represent their desires, and each item imbues them with the intelligence, heart, and courage they had all along. Oz then decides to take Dorothy with him back home. That is until Toto causes the ropes to break and he is forced to leave her behind. After that, there's another sort of mini-adventure, which leaves the Scarecrow as the ruler of Oz, the Cowardly Lion as the king of the forest, and the Tin Man in charge of another mystical land. But long story short, Dorothy uses her last 2 monkey wishes to travel to Glenda the Good Witch's castle, where she's told that she had the power to go back home the entire time. It just takes 3 clicks of her silver slippers, which she does, and arrives back to Kansas safe and sound. Unless you go by the horrifying 1985 adaptation where Dorothy is forced into a mental institution to undergo electroshock therapy due to her insistence that Oz was a real place.
Will it hurt?
No. It just manages electrical current.
Now before going further, let's address the elephant in the room. L. Frank Baum held some truly repulsive beliefs about the treatment and lives of indigenous peoples. He expressed and gave these opinions within 2 editorials in 1890 and again in 1891, both of which surfaced in the 1990s. As you can imagine, it was a troubling discovery for those who celebrated the author's legacy, as his contribution to children's literature and fantasy is nothing short of profound. So it's critical that we acknowledge the abhorrent statements he made within his personal life, but also allow ourselves to be able to discuss the Oz works and adaptations on their own merit. That said, when The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published in the year 1900, it was an immediate success, and was the best-selling children's book for 2 years straight. This in turn led to an interest in a live-action adaptation of the story, and its first iteration was an elaborate stage play. L. Frank Baum wrote the script, which was a very faithful retelling of his book, and wound up selling it to the manager of the Chicago Grand Opera House. Unfortunately for the author, the director assigned to the play did not like the script, as he felt it was lacking the spectacle for a proper theater show. So major changes were made to the characters, story, and overall plot, which was done against the wishes of L. Frank Baum. For example, Toto the cute and cuddly dog was replaced by Imogen, the cow. It was also made into a musical, with mature jokes and themes to better appeal to older patrons and adults. In fact, aside from the 3 main characters and using a mythical land called Oz, there's almost more differences than similarities when compared to the book. It also featured the most terrifying iteration of the Tin Man and Scarecrow imaginable, and I apologize in advance for them inevitably haunting your dreams. Anyway, the stage play opened in 1902 as simply The Wizard of Oz, and despite the criticisms from author L. Frank Baum regarding all the changes, it was a massive success. Its initial run was such a hit that The Wizard of Oz played on Broadway in 1903, and would tour nationally for another 6 years after that. But as far as the first live-action film adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, that requires a bit of backtracking to the book's publication in the year 1900. You see, L. Frank Baum had initially envisioned his fantasy writings of the Land of Oz as a single self-contained story. But his next fantasy book, Dot and Tot of Merryland, was a failure, and he was also receiving thousands of letters from children begging for another Oz book. So the author caved and wrote a sequel to The Wizard of Oz. Then another sequel. And another. To promote the book's 4th entry, he developed a live-action film adaptation for use in a traveling multimedia theater show, known as the Fairy Log and Radio Plays. Though visuals are incredibly difficult to come by, the show would feature live actors interacting with various scenes from the Oz books put on motion picture film. Although, keep in mind, motion pictures were still very much in their infancy, with the first publicly screened movie just 10 years earlier, so most of this was experimental at best. Unfortunately, while the elaborate show played to sold-out theaters and houses, the production cost more money to produce than it made, and lasted just a few months. This caused L. Frank Baum to go bankrupt, so he sold the film rights of his first Oz book to a motion picture company in 1910. They were the ones to produce the first ever standalone film adaptation of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The movie had a runtime of just over 12 minutes, and minus a few exceptions, was more of an adaptation of the stage show musical than the book. Reviews for the film were far from enthusiastic, and if you go by today's standards, was a flop, but 2 sequels were produced nonetheless. However, unlike the first, footage of either of these have yet to be found, but some visuals have surfaced in the years since it was released. The next attempt at a live-action film adaptation was based on L. Frank Baum's 7th book, The Patchwork Girl of Oz. Now, just how the author was able to reacquire the rights to his books is a bit murky, but in 1914 his finances did improve enough to establish the Oz Film Manufacturing Company. The Patchwork Girl of Oz was the author's first film, and he had total creative control, but was also, by all accounts, a major flop, both in terms of its reception and revenue. The film's sequel, His Majesty the Scarecrow of Oz, was poorly received and also a financial failure, as was Baum's final film adaptation, The Magic Cloak of Oz. And yes, much like the stage play, these silent films were filled with unintentional nightmare fuel. For nearly a decade, there were no other attempts to bring the characters of Oz to the big screen, as the author stuck to creating more literary sequels as opposed to films. All told, over the course of 20 years, L. Frank Baum wrote 14 Wizard of Oz books, with the final 2 published after his death in 1919 at the age of 62. The book's publisher did allow other authors to continue the Oz anthology. Because, you know, money. But none of them were as well received or as successful as the ones written by Baum. 1925 finally saw another effort to translate the world of Oz onto film, but this one fared even worse than the ones that came before it. It was produced by Chadwick Pictures and directed by Larry Semin, and took an absurd amount of creative liberties from the source material. Much like the others, aside from the title, location, and characters, the story itself had little to nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz books or its sequels. The movie also carried on the trend of being both a commercial failure and critical flop, which forced its production company to go bankrupt. The movie's director also went bankrupt, and insinuations were made that the ceaseless worry and financial troubles of the failed Oz film, in part, led to his death 3 years later. For the remainder of the 1920s and most of the 30s, aside from an 8-minute animated short, this was the last attempt at a live-action adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. The reason being that with the failure of every attempt so far, it was seen as a more or less unfilmable story. Going further, most Hollywood studio executives actively stayed away from producing anything in the fantasy genre period. Their view was that fantasy films only appealed to kids, who paid a fraction of admission costs, so the real money was in making movies that appealed to older audiences. But then one film came along that proved a fantasy story could appeal to all ages.
The picture that every newspaper and magazine critic is raving about. Hear what the usually hard-boiled reviewer of Time magazine says. Snow White is as exciting as a Western, as funny as a haywire comedy. It combines the classic idiom of folklore drama with rollicking comic strip humor. It is an authentic masterpiece.
Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a groundbreaking achievement for quite a few reasons. It was the first feature-length animated film in the US, the highest-grossing film of all time, and most important to our story, a children's film based on a fantasy book everybody wanted to see. So all of a sudden, the idea of once again adapting The Wizard of Oz into a feature film was an alluring possibility. Now, as far as who officially jump-started this iteration, the straightforward answer was the co-founder of MGM Studios, Louis B. Mayer. For those unaware, MGM, or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was the result of the merging of 3 separate film studios years earlier: Metro Pictures Corporation, Samuel Goldwyn Studios, and Louis B. Mayer Productions, Inc. The reason for this was due to all 3 movie companies being purchased by theater owner Marcus Loew, who put Louis B. Mayer in charge of the newly formed Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which was commonly shortened to MGM. Louis B. Mayer soon rose to be the most powerful executive in Hollywood history, with essentially his own empire where he was the ruler. He spared absolutely no expense to acquire what he wanted, as was the case with the film rights to Oz, which at that point belonged to a man named Samuel Goldwyn. It's a bit convoluted, but basically the film rights to L. Frank Baum's Oz series went to his wife Maud Baum after his death. Years later, she then transferred the rights to her eldest son, Frank J. Baum. In 1925, he sold the film rights to Chadwick Pictures, but when the movie tanked and caused the production company to go bankrupt, the rights returned. Frank J. Baum was then approached in 1934 by Samuel Goldwyn, and he wound up selling the film rights again, but this time for $40,000. Samuel Goldwyn, as you can probably surmise, was the founder of Samuel Goldwyn Studios, but since fantasy films were seen as a guaranteed flop, his Oz project stalled. Samuel Goldwyn eventually left his own studio because he was clashing with investors, but took the film rights to The Wizard of Oz with him. When Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was formed, despite absorbing Goldwyn Studios and even the iconic Leo the Lion mascot, the rights were still with good old Samuel. So when Louis B. Mayer wanted to acquire the film rights, he had to negotiate with Samuel Goldwyn, but it wasn't going to be cheap. You see, thanks to the success of Snow White, Samuel knew his film rights to Oz were quite valuable, and asked for a staggering $75,000, which equates to about $1.64 million today. Back then, this was an unheard of amount, but Louis B. Mayer believed MGM had a golden opportunity to make the first faithful, not to mention successful adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. Now, the movie mogul was essential to the rights acquisition itself. However, this never would have happened if not for two other key players in our story, Arthur Freed and Mervyn LeRoy. Arthur Freed was a lyricist who was brought to MGM in 1928, and wrote the music and lyrics to a number of successful musicals in the early to mid-30s. But he was also looking to produce musicals as well, particularly one that could serve as a vehicle for an up-and-coming 15-year-old actress, singer, and dancer by the name of Judy Garland.
Amos, you're a-going and I'm a-going with. I aim to learn to sing proper.
Now, look-a-here, Sari.
Now, you know how I can sing.
Originally born as Frances Ethel Gum, she was initially part of a song and dance trio known as the Gum Sisters, and appeared in a variety of movies. Eventually, she wound up changing her stage name to Judy Garland, and was signed on to a contract with MGM Studios in 1935. Though immensely talented, MGM executives never thought of her as the glamorous type, so she often played quirky girl-next-door characters. In fact, as awful as it sounds, Louis B. Mayer would often refer to Judy Garland as his, quote, little hunchback. Others called her the ugly duckling behind her back, even though at the same time she was being praised as one of MGM's most promising young stars. Now, Arthur Freed had worked very closely with Garland in the movie Broadway Melody of 1938, as well as Thoroughbreds Don't Cry, but again, only as a lyricist. Still, he was able to see that she possessed an enormous amount of raw talent, and was determined to have her star within a musical extravaganza he himself would produce. So Arthur Freed expressed his aspirations to Louis B. Mayer, in which he was granted the new role of associate producer. With this new title, he was told to go find an established property for Judy Garland to star. But here's where things get murky, because if you go by Arthur Freed's version of events, he then met with a literary agent by the name of Frank Orsatti. At some point, the agent mentioned that the film rights to The Wizard of Oz were available, which just so happened to be Arthur Freed's favorite book as a child. Upon hearing this, he instantly envisioned Judy Garland as Dorothy Gale, believing she embodied all of the character's qualities and was destined for the role. He then convinced Louis B. Mayer to acquire the film rights, as the perfect vehicle for her career as an actress and his as an aspiring producer. But there's a slightly different account of events by the other key player in Oz's journey to the big screen, Mervyn LeRoy. Unlike Arthur Freed, Mervyn LeRoy gained prominence over at Warner Brothers in the early to mid-30s, as one of the studio's most talented and efficient directors. He'd also been one of the few filmmakers to openly embrace a relatively new concept, to focus on the quality of movies as opposed to the quantity. This was essentially unheard of back then, as most studios pumped out movies like an assembly line, usually well over 50 per year, hoping every so often one would stick. By contrast, Mervyn LeRoy wanted to focus on finding artistic perfection within his films, and was growing frustrated with the studio's mass production mentality. But that's when his work over at Warner Brothers caught the attention of Louis B. Mayer himself, and he was offered his own production unit as a producer at MGM. Mervyn LeRoy was to be given unparalleled creative control, and according to his side of the story, was asked by Louis B. Mayer what movie he wanted to make first. His reply? A faithful adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. Much like Arthur Freed, Mervyn LeRoy also had a love for the books as a child, and in his adult years dreamed of making the so-called unfilmable fantasy book into a feature film. Where the situation gets murky is that both of them claim to have been the ones Louis B. Mayer bought the property for, and each say that they had the idea to make the film in the first place. There is some evidence it was indeed Arthur Freed, such as an office memo for the casting of Oz, which he sent before Mervyn LeRoy had even started at MGM. Ultimately, what we do know is that Mervyn LeRoy was assigned as the film's producer, with Arthur Freed as an associate producer due to his lack of experience. Regardless of who set the wheels in motion first, Louis B. Mayer officially acquired the film rights to The Wizard of Oz for MGM in 1938, thus beginning pre-production on one of the most ambitious films ever made. Chosen to be the film's director was Academy Award-winning filmmaker Norman Taurog, whose expertise was directing movies that appealed to both kids and adults. For the film's music and lyrics, Arthur Freed chose songwriters Yip Harburg and Harold Arlen. These two were given a very daunting task, part of which entailed creating songs for a musical fantasy film, which hadn't really been done before. Going further, they were also to embrace a relatively new style of cinema, the integrated musical. This basically meant that instead of showstoppers or isolated musical numbers, the songs were interwoven directly into the narrative. For example, most musicals of the 20s and 30s could have their musical numbers removed, or even swapped around with different actors, with little to no effect on the story. But Yip Harburg and Harold Arlen were chosen to write songs for Oz that drove the plot forward, and that were inseparable from the characters who sang them.
The lyrics are the wings to the music, and the music are the wings to the lyrics. Without it, they're clay-footed and they lie on the ground.
When it came to the film script, or rather scripts, there were upwards of a staggering 15 to 16 different writers. Some treatments were more like the stage play, which drastically veered away from the original source material. Others downplayed or omitted the film's magical fantasy elements altogether, as a more straightforward musical drama. MGM would also contract multiple writers to develop treatments at the same time, without the writers knowing they were just one of the many involved. Because of this, it's impossible to attribute the final screenplay to just one individual, as parts of different scripts from different writers are sprinkled throughout. For instance, some elements like showing Kansas in black and white and introducing color when landing in Oz were taken from a treatment by Herman Mankiewicz, the controversial co-writer of Citizen Kane. Virtually everything else from his screenplay was disregarded, and he was never officially given credit despite such a huge contribution to the story. That said, the writer that had the most to do with the final script was Noel Langley, with official credit also given to Florence Rison and Alan Wolfe. But casting the movie also had its fair share of hardships, such as deciding who was to play Dorothy.
I had lots of fun in Bermuda with the horse and buggy, but I'm glad to be back in New York, because after all, there's no place like home.
You see, the executives of Lowe's Inc., who remember owned MGM, had set their eyes on Shirley Temple. At the time, she was one of the highest paid actresses within the entire industry, and executives believed her casting alone would guarantee Oz's success. Interestingly, she had also recently presented Walt Disney with a special Academy Award for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the movie which in part led to The Wizard of Oz's development at MGM. However, producers Mervyn LeRoy and especially Arthur Freed felt like they already had the perfect Dorothy, with the aforementioned Judy Garland. True, she was a bit older than the character in the book, but they were adamant she was a much better fit for the part than Shirley Temple. Garland had also gained quite a bit of fame since the project's initial development earlier that year, largely from playing the love interest of child star Mickey Rooney in the smash hit, Love Finds Andy Hardy.
Am I sensational?
I'll say.
Well, Andy, even though I'm only a little girl, even little girls can see ahead.
But despite Judy Garland's newfound fame, Lowe's executives insisted to the producers that they go with Shirley Temple, and this led to a bit of a stalemate. Ultimately, the decision came down to singing ability, as the producers made the argument that Shirley Temple lacked a wide enough vocal range for the part. So Judy Garland was entrusted with the role of Dorothy Gale, one that, for better or worse, would define the actress's career for the rest of her life. Moving along, to play the Scarecrow they chose vaudevillian actor Ray Bolger, whose gangly stature and so-called rubber legs gave him a distinct brand of physical comedy. For the part of the Cowardly Lion, they chose Burt Lahr, an actor whose wild facial expressions were an essential part of his brand of comedy. To play the part of the Tin Man, another vaudevillian actor was chosen by the name of Buddy Ebsen, who of the three was far less outlandish in his comedic style. By sheer coincidence, the previous year he had also done a movie with Judy Garland, and another movie with Shirley Temple the year before that. Unfortunately, one of these actors was forced to abandon the movie midway through filming, which nearly shut down production altogether. But more on that later. To play the character of the Wicked Witch of the West, the filmmakers initially hired an actress by the name of Gail Sondergaard.
Life is strange. Is it not, monsieur?
Incredibly.
Gail Sondergaard had risen to fame a few years earlier, as the first female in history to win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The award was for the movie Anthony Adverse, which was also her very first role in a feature film, and just so happened to be directed by Oz producer Mervyn LeRoy. But if you're thinking she's a bit too glamorous to play the Wicked Witch of the West, this was by choice. Initially, the Wicked Witch was envisioned as seductive and beautiful, much like the evil queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So the actress was dressed in a form-fitting black gown with black sequins, and for a time, this is what they planned to go with. Other characters like the Tin Man, Scarecrow, and Cowardly Lion also had drastically different initial appearances, with far less reliance on prosthetics and more on makeup. Thankfully, they were improved quite a bit during the pre-production process, and would evolve even further right up until shooting. This leads us into the first iteration of Dorothy, which unlike the others would actually make it into the film. Kind of. The idea was to emulate the character's golden blonde hair as she appears in the books, and to give Garland a bit more glamour compared to her previous roles. So the actress was given a blonde wig, a more stylish dress, and a ton of makeup for a sort of baby doll look. There's actually quite a few photographs taken of this blonde version of Dorothy, but the previous two photos are the only ones known to be in color. Now, about the time all these wardrobe and makeup tests were done, the film's director Norman Taurog was suddenly taken off the film. The reason had to do with the workload of his other MGM picture, Boys Town, as directors under contract often had more than one movie going on at the same time. So to replace Norman Taurog, MGM executives chose Richard Thorpe, who was known for his ability to shoot a movie fast, deliver it on schedule, and within budget. But production was facing another issue, as even with its then massive budget of $1.7 million, executives feared it would not be enough. For reference, that same year The Adventures of Robin Hood was Warner Bros.' most expensive movie ever made, which cost a bit more at $2 million. In the case of The Wizard of Oz, a large portion of the budget was going towards massive and elaborate sets, with immense detail in virtually every corner. Another enormous cost were the plans to film most of the movie in 3-strip Technicolor. This was a relatively new innovation that was a sight to behold, but also cost 4 times the amount as black and white. The process also required massive cameras that weighed upwards of 500 pounds, which meant that the movie cinematography was going to be that much more difficult. However, even with all these initial pre-production hurdles, the film went forward as planned, and was set to begin shooting October 12, 1938. Unfortunately, just 7 days before filming was set to begin, Gail Sondergaard, who was to play the Wicked Witch of the West, quit the movie. It turns out MGM executives began to insist that she appear in the film as an ugly witch, much like how the character appears in the book. So Gail Sondergaard underwent another series of wardrobe and makeup tests, only this time as a more stereotypical haggard witch. But the contrast of her natural beauty and so-called ugly makeup was poorly received, and led to Sondergaard requesting to be taken off the film. She also admitted that she had no desire to make herself ugly for any motion picture, and producer Mervyn LeRoy didn't want that for her career either. So a mutual agreement was reached to let her go, with only days to find a suitable replacement for one of the film's most important characters. Ultimately, the part of the Wicked Witch of the West was fulfilled, and wound up going to an MGM contract player by the name of Margaret Hamilton. Coincidentally, the previous year she'd also starred alongside actor Frank Morgan, who was chosen to play the Wizard of Oz himself. Now, we could go on and on just talking about casting alone, such as the task of finding over 100 little people to play the Munchkins. They were to be paid $50 to $100 per week, as some had actual lines of dialogue in the movie, with others simply in the background. There was also the search to find the perfect Toto, which wound up being a brindle Cairn Terrier named Terry. This lovable dogtress was paid even more at $125 a week. Or rather, her owner was. But let's move on to October 12, 1938, when The Wizard of Oz officially began principal photography.
First we visit the land of Oz, and because The Wizard of Oz is being filmed entirely in Technicolor, actually billions of candle power are being poured onto this set, enough to light a fair-sized city. The setting is the cornfield. Far below you see the cameraman about to photograph a scene with Judy Garland, who plays Dorothy, the little sweetheart of Oz.
First, we'll focus on the first 12 days, which are some of the more infamous, and in some ways, mysterious periods of the film's production history. Under the leadership of the film's second director, Richard Thorpe, 2 lengthy sequences were shot. One of them was Dorothy's encounter with the Scarecrow, as well as the elaborate dance sequence and musical number, If I Only Had a Brain. The other was the final act at the witch's castle, in which the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion rescue Dorothy. Now, the reason why the first 2 weeks of filming is a bit of a mystery is due to the fact that no footage has ever surfaced of the scenes themselves. All that we have are some home movies shot by the film's composer Harold Arlen, plus a brief glimpse within a 1930s MGM documentary. The sequences that were filmed are a sort of holy grail of lost movie footage, as this version of Oz was going to be drastically different, and would have possibly wound up being a disaster. As a quick refresh, Judy Garland's Dorothy was adorned with blonde hair and a ton of makeup, for a sort of baby doll look. Also notice the iconic yellow brick road, which under Richard Thorpe's direction looked, well, pretty awful. This version was simply a yellow oval brick pattern spray painted onto plywood, with no dimension or shape, which gave it more of a cheap stage play vibe. There was also the initial look of the Wicked Witch of the West, with a painfully obvious wig, minimal makeup, and prosthetics, which made her appear far less menacing. But even going beyond all these differences in character appearance, Richard Thorpe's direction was possibly the biggest problem. Those who were there and saw everything that was shot described it as manic, and was lacking in sincerity. In particular, he directed Judy Garland to play the character of Dorothy like a fairy tale princess, and her performance was described as artificial. Producer Mervyn LeRoy was especially unimpressed, and supposedly hated virtually everything he saw once the dailies came in. Now, just how far this would have gone without studio interference is up for debate, as just 2 weeks into production was the film's first major disaster. The incident had to do with the actor who was playing the Tin Man, Buddy Ebsen, or rather his makeup, which was comprised of grease paint and aluminum dust.
They had never made a tin suit before, and they'd never made up anybody as a Tin Man. What they used for makeup was aluminum dust, and powdered my face with aluminum dust. It creates a cloud of aluminum dust in the air, and you're going to breathe some of that stuff. At the end of 10 days, I had breathed so much of it, my lungs were coated interiorly, and it choked off the oxygen. I yelled for help. They took me to the hospital, and I spent 6 weeks there.
Buddy Ebsen's hospitalization led to the entire film to get shut down, and was incredibly close to staying that way. The shutdown was at the request of MGM's parent company Lowe's Inc., who were also concerned with the film's rising costs, and Richard Thorpe's mishandling of the film. Going further, with this most recent incident, their initial reaction was to cut their losses and shut down production permanently. But producer Mervyn LeRoy convinced them otherwise, with the assurance he would remedy the situation ASAP. First, he fired Richard Thorpe as the movie's director, as his approach and vision for the film was clearly misaligned. Chosen as the movie's new director, its third if you're keeping count, was George Cukor. George Cukor was a prominent director over at RKO Pictures, and was known for his ability to connect on a deep level with his performers. He was also attached to direct one of Hollywood's other major motion pictures, Gone with the Wind. However, the movie was in a state of pre-production limbo, with filming set to begin a few months later in January 1939. So while he waited to direct that movie, George Cukor agreed to come aboard The Wizard of Oz, at least until Gone with the Wind was ready to begin shooting. Though George Cukor admitted to having no real passion or even interest in the Oz books, he was able to see aspects of the production that were in desperate need of changing. The most important had to do with the character of Dorothy, or more specifically Judy Garland's portrayal. He was appalled by the over-glamorized baby doll look Richard Thorpe had gone for, and felt Judy Garland's performance was just as inappropriate. So George Cukor oversaw the complete overhaul of her look, utilizing her natural brown hair with more subtle makeup, and experimented with different dresses, braids, and ribbons. He also advised Judy Garland to play the character of Dorothy as herself, and to act more naturally instead of like a character. Another George Cukor initiative were minor changes to the appearance of the Scarecrow, as well as drastic alterations to the makeup for the Wicked Witch of the West. Going further, he assisted with the casting of Jack Haley as the Tin Man, as opposed to waiting for Buddy Ebsen to recover in the hospital. But don't feel too bad for the former Tin Man, as even with his serious affliction he made a full recovery, and actually wound up outliving all the other cast members to the age of 95. He also arguably had the most successful career post-Oz, playing George Russell and Davy Crockett, Jed Clampett in the Beverly Hillbillies, and was used by Walt Disney for his Dancing Man project, which of course later evolved into audio animatronics. Anyway, as a surprise to no one, George Cukor had Oz's makeup department develop a new aluminum paste, which was much safer than aluminum powder. although it did wind up giving Jack Haley a severe eye infection, and he was forced to live day and night in a darkened room for about a week to allow it to heal. George Cukor also decided to have the Wizard of Oz's art department change the yellow brick road. They ultimately used a material known as masonite, and gave it the texture and shape to resemble an actual yellow brick road. Now on the obvious plus side, every single one of these suggestions would infinitely improve the movie. On the other hand, it also meant the 2 weeks worth of filming under director Richard Thorpe was scrapped, forcing production to start over. News publications at the time falsely reported that Richard Thorpe had suddenly become ill, and had to drop out of the film. In his place was of course to be George Cukor, which was promoted to the public. But before a single frame of new footage was shot, The Wizard of Oz's third director dropped out, just 1 week after he came aboard. The reason had to do with Gone with the Wind, as that movie was dealing with its own production troubles, and it was necessary for George Cukor to go back earlier than expected. So once again, The Wizard of Oz was in need of a new director, and this time Mervyn LeRoy chose filmmaker Victor Fleming. Though far from a household name, Victor Fleming was a jack of all trades of sorts, as he'd worked his way up in the industry doing everything from camera operating to stunt work. On top of this, he'd also directed films in almost every genre, so Mervyn LeRoy believed he could handle Oz's delicate balance of drama, music, comedy, and horror. However, Victor Fleming was initially very reluctant to join the increasingly troubled project, but he eventually signed on out of a desire to make a film for his daughters. The movie then went through another series of rewrites by John Lee Mahin, who was Victor Fleming's associate and screenwriter. After that, it was time to once again begin filming, but the movie's production troubles were far from over.
Camera's ready. Sound is ready. Places, everybody. Quiet, please. Speed.
1, 2, 3.
The first sequence to be refilmed with all these new changes was Dorothy meeting the Scarecrow. This particular scene co-starred a trained raven by the name of Jimmy, who was to be shown pecking at the Scarecrow's straw and would then fly away. You can also see this raven within Harold Arlen's home movies, and the bird's intelligence was comparable to an average 8-year-old child. However, when filming the scene, Jimmy somehow broke the hidden thread he was attached to, and flew 60 or so feet up to the top of the soundstage. Now, as bizarre as it sounds, Jimmy the Raven was the only trained raven in Hollywood, which meant it wasn't as simple as just getting another. With few options available, an assistant electrician had to climb up 5 stories to the top of the building, as an effort to capture the stubborn bird. 5 or 6 hours later, the bird still refused to come down, so everybody went home and filming was once again delayed, although the bird was finally captured around 2 a.m. Later that week, after they were able to successfully film Scarecrow's cornfield scene, they spent 3 days filming the introduction of the Tin Man. Unfortunately, the most recent scene shot with the Tin Man's costume had been at the Witch's Castle, when the director was still Richard Thorpe. Notice how the Tin Man's all polished up and shiny, because at this point in the story he's already been cleaned up at the Emerald City. The problem was that when production started over with the new director, they used this version of the Tin Man's costume. But, and this is a big but, since they chose to film everything before his arrival to the Emerald City, he was supposed to be all rusty and weathered, which is kind of integral to the story. So over the course of 3 days they shot the introduction of the Tin Man, as well as his elaborate musical number, with the wrong tin suit. It was only after the entire sequence was finished that they realized the continuity error, forcing them to scrap everything that was filmed. The reshoots with his rusty costume pushed the film even further behind schedule, and came at the cost of almost $60,000, or just over $1.3 million today. But the production troubles of Oz were only beginning, as another major problem were the soundstage's absolutely scorching heat. This was a direct result of shooting in Technicolor, as it required intense lighting to properly expose the film, much more than black and white. In fact, since the movie sets were so incredibly massive, they actually had to borrow additional lights from rival studios. Because of all this, the production wound up using more electricity than any other movie in history, the cost of which was far beyond what was anticipated. The amount of power usage even caused a number of brownouts in nearby cities, which understandably led to a lot of angry residents and city officials. Keep in mind, air conditioning was also fairly primitive back then, so these sound stages often rose to extreme temperatures of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This was especially miserable for the companions of Dorothy, such as Ray Bolger, whose Scarecrow makeup essentially clogged up all the pores in his face. As a result, the actor wasn't able to properly sweat or cool himself off, so he occasionally struggled to even breathe. Similarly, Bert Lahr's costume was made of real lion skin and fur, which weighed upwards of 100 pounds, and had to be blow-dried in between takes to cool him down. This was also done to dry out the accumulation of perspiration in his suit, otherwise bacteria would grow and give off an unpleasant odor. One of the only solutions for the problematic heat was to stop all production and open the soundstage doors, allowing it to air out. But this resulted in a very slow filming pace, as while the average production was able to get 4 scene setups in half a morning, they were lucky to get 4 setups in the entire day. More production time equaled more money, and it wasn't long before the film was well past its initial $2 million budget. Executives over at Lowe's Inc. were once again tempted to shut down production altogether, but producer Mervyn LeRoy once again convinced them otherwise. So the show went on, and despite these miserable conditions and a handful of other incidents, which we'll get to, the mood on the set was overall positive. In fact, the only way the cast and crew were able to make it through the ordeal was by keeping the atmosphere light with spirits held high, even if there was the occasional actor rivalry.
Whenever we do that little dance up the yellow brick road,
yeah, I remember that.
I was supposed to be with them.
Yeah.
You know.
They'd crowd you out.
They'd shut me out. They'd close in the 3 of them, and I would be in back of them dancing.
Now, unfortunately, it's time to address another elephant in the room, which is that by this point, 16-year-old Judy Garland was on the most abhorrent so-called diet imaginable. This consisted mostly of chicken soup, black coffee, several packs of cigarettes a day, amphetamines every 4 hours to stay awake and alert, and barbiturates to fall asleep. The reprehensible routine allegedly begun as early as 14 when she signed on to MGM, under the direct orders of Louis B. Mayer. It was done as a way to both control her weight and keep her working absurdly long hours, as Judy Garland was often on set upwards of 12 to 18 hours a day. This was tragically allowed to happen by way of the permission of Garland's stage mother from hell, who saw her daughter as little more than a meal ticket. For The Wizard of Oz, this regimen was ramped up even further, with very few on the cast or crew knowing the extent of this abuse. Although she did confess to a co-star that her abundance of energy was manufactured, and that she relied on the uppers and downers to even function. In Garland's own words, quote, "They'd give us the pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they would take us up to the studio hospital and knock us out with sleeping pills." All that said, as an effort to be entirely transparent, the accuracy of these assertions have been subject to a lot of contention over the years. For example, her lifelong friend and fellow co-star Mickey Rooney emphatically denied the drugs and abuse ever happened. But given the absurd amount of control studios had over their stars back then, not to mention second-hand accounts, most believe her claims in later years to be true. Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch, was the one Garland would occasionally confide to, so she did her best to keep an eye on the young star. Unfortunately, she was also the one who experienced possibly the most serious accident on set. It happened in the Munchkinland scene, where the Wicked Witch drops down beneath the floor through a hidden drop shaft, with an explosion of fire. The trapdoor was just a bit wider than Margaret Hamilton's shoulders, so if she was even half a foot off her mark, her arms or legs might get caught going down, and as she was warned, broken. The first 3 takes went off without a hitch. She hit her mark, was lowered down, and the explosions went off. However, on the 4th take, the explosions occurred before she was all the way down, which resulted in 2nd and 3rd degree burns on her hands and face. This put the actress in the hospital, and she spent 6 weeks recuperating before returning back to the set. As if that wasn't bad enough, another horrific accident happened to her stunt double Betty Danko, also involving fire. The incident happened for the sequence where the Wicked Witch spells out "Surrender Dorothy," but for a shot that never made it to the final film. This would have shown the witch ride her broom across the sky, or rather on wires across the set, with smoke emitting from her broom by way of a smoking device. However, Margaret Hamilton absolutely refused to do any more scenes involving stunts, fire, or smoke, and was only willing to do a close-up using rear projection and a wind machine. So for the other shot using actual smoke, they used her stunt double, and a smoking pipe mechanism was installed onto her broom. The first 2 times worked as intended, however on the 3rd take the device caused an explosion, which gave the performer a 2-inch deep wound on her leg and thigh. The stunt double was rushed to the hospital, and remained there for 11 days, but the footage was never used in the final film. Coincidentally, 2 of the flying monkeys had also been sent to that same hospital weeks earlier, after the wires broke that were suspending them from the ceiling. Of course, probably the most infamous production problem, or rather a problem they were blissfully unaware was a problem, was the poppy field sequence. The reason, as I'm sure most of you watching already know, is that the fake snow poured all over the actors was made of pure asbestos, aka cancer-causing insulation, although some assert it was actually a chemical known as gypsum, or a combination of both, which even if true, isn't all that much better. That said, in their defense, the initial connection between asbestos exposure and variations of lung cancer was only discovered 4 to 5 years earlier. It wasn't until the 1940s that the dangers of asbestos became much more widespread, and wasn't officially recognized as cancer-causing until 1949, so the filmmakers simply didn't know any better. But like many profitable health hazards, asbestos was pushed as totally safe onto the American public for decades to come, with its dangers suppressed to an absurd degree.
The people who use asbestos cement siding report with satisfaction. It keeps homes snug and tight against all kinds of weather. It gives real protection against the hazards of fire. And so, we suggest you consider this material for the walls of your home. Designed to last a lifetime, a trouble-free lifetime.
The final blow to the film's production came near the end of filming, when the announcement was made that the movie's director Victor Fleming was going to be replaced. However, unlike the previous instances of the film losing its director, this time it was under much more amicable circumstances. Without going too far down a bunny trail, over at Selznick International, filming of Gone with the Wind was about 3 weeks in, with former Oz director George Cukor at the helm. But there was a huge controversy over how he was handling the film, as well as his dissatisfaction with the movie script. He'd evidently refused to shoot the rest of the movie unless there were drastic rewrites, and while this did eventually happen, he was taken off the film. Although some assert this also had to do with actor Clark Gable, as it's alleged he was a vocal homophobe and was uncomfortable being directed by George Cukor, who was openly gay himself. Either way, to replace George Cukor, Gone with the Wind's executive producer David O. Selznick desperately wanted Oz's current director, Victor Fleming. Of course, he was still very much in the middle of filming Oz, and had several weeks left of shooting, as well as the entire post-production process. But David O. Selznick was eventually able to convince Victor Fleming to take over Gone with the Wind, who saved yet another ambitious film from getting shut down. His one stipulation was to be allowed to finish the rest of Oz's Technicolor sequences, and to supervise the editing as well as the screening process. So the cast and crew bid Victor Fleming farewell, and the film's 5th director was brought on board, King Vidor. King Vidor would direct all of the movie's black and white sequences in Kansas, both before and after Dorothy Goes to Oz. He would also direct the film's most iconic musical number, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. One of his most valuable contributions was directing Judy Garland to move freely throughout the scene, and to not sing to the camera like most musicals. By March 16th, despite being months behind schedule and almost $1 million over budget, principal photography officially ended for The Wizard of Oz. Without much fanfare, most of the actors, cast, and crew immediately moved on to other projects. One example was Judy Garland, who just a few weeks later began rehearsing for Babes in Arms, a movie that would turn out to be one of the biggest hits of 1939. It also coincidentally featured her Wizard of Oz co-star, Margaret Hamilton. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the daunting task of editing, composing, and creating the special effects for Oz were underway, which took nearly 4 months. One of the most impressive practical effects, even by today's standards, was the film's tornado sequence. To achieve the illusion, they used a 35-foot-long stocking, which was wrapped around chicken wire. The prop was spun around by way of a motor, hooked up to a massive crane, and dragged across a model of the farmhouse with a pickup truck, while blowing dust and smoke. But by far the most contentious aspect of the movie's post-production was all the footage left on the cutting room floor, much of which has since more than likely been destroyed. You see, the original rough cut of The Wizard of Oz was just shy of 2 hours, although its precise runtime is unknown. This was shown to the public for a preview on June 1st, 1939, at the Granada Theater in Santa Barbara, California. It was also shown a few days later on June 4th, at the Fox Theater in San Bernardino, California. This 2-hour version of Oz is another holy grail of lost movie footage, as aside from those who worked on the film, it was only ever shown to these 2 test audiences. So using the continuity script made during the editing process, let's explore the now lost parts of the film audiences would have seen, and go over when and why they were cut. The beginning of the film, of course, starts with Dorothy on the farm in Kansas, and the first cutscene would have been just after she walks away from the chicken coop. Her Uncle Henry and Auntie Em exchange some dialogue, with Henry feeling bad for the poor orphan Dorothy, expressing that she could use a friend. In the scene immediately after, if you've ever wondered what the character Hickory, aka the Tin Man, is doing with that wire and where he goes off to, it had to do with a now missing subplot. Dorothy follows Hickory into the barn, where he works on a so-called wind machine, and talks about Miss Gulch lacking a heart, and how his joints feel rusted. This eventually cut scene actually explains a goof in the final film, in which the other farmhands have lines of dialogue foreshadowing their Oz characters, but Hickory/Tin Man doesn't.
You ain't using your head about, Miss Gulch. Think you didn't have any brains at all.
She ain't nothing to be afraid of. Have a little courage, that's all.
It also explains what Auntie Em is referencing a bit later.
Well, Dorothy was walking along.
I saw you tinkering with that contraption, Hickory. Now you and Hunk get back to that wagon.
Further in the movie, Dorothy's encounter with Professor Marvel was quite a bit longer. She tells him why she's running away from home, and there was additional foreshadowing of her upcoming adventure in Oz. As Dorothy leaves the wagon, she has some dialogue about her decision to give up Toto to the farmhand Hunk, as a way to save her dog from Mrs. Gulch. Hickory's wind machine also got one final mention, as the fierce tornado makes its way to the farmhouse. Speaking of the tornado, the sequence inside the house was much longer, with additional special effects shots and even more reactions from both Dorothy and Toto.
Toto? I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
After Dorothy leaves Munchkinland to follow the Yellow Brick Road, there was an elaborate dance sequence with the Scarecrow. This was part of the If I Only Had a Brain musical number, and is the only cutscene that has ever surfaced in its entirety. Another sequence that was only seen during these previews has to do with the witch's threat of turning the Tin Man into a beehive.
And you! I'll use you for a beehive.
Soon after, a swarm of honeybees emerged out of the Tin Man's chest, and Dorothy hides behind a nearby tree. The Tin Man accidentally kills one of the bees and becomes emotionally distraught, believing his action was due to him not having a heart. But Dorothy assures him that the bee would have died anyway, and the trio carry on as seen in the final film. There was also more dialogue in the poppy field scene, and the film originally cut back to the witch at her castle, with a reference to her wishing cap that appears in the book.
Orders are, nobody can see the Great Oz, not nobody, not no-how.
Once they arrive to the Emerald City, there was a gag as the trio desperately pleads with the guard to see the wizard. It happened about halfway through their exchange, in which the Ozian declares it's time to change the guards and walks towards a sentry house. There he turned his obviously fake mustache upside down, as an attempt to disguise himself as another guard. He then returned to the group, with the only change in appearance being his now upside-down mustache, which causes a continuity error in the final film. Once the group is on their way to kill the Wicked Witch, we see them in the haunted forest holding on to a variety of weapons. The Scarecrow has a gun, the Cowardly Lion a butterfly net and a can of witch remover spray, and the Tin Man a wrench. However, in the preview, there was more to this setup.
I'd turn back if I were you.
Suddenly, the witch remover spray can vanishes like spooky magic, and the butterfly net flies out of the Cowardly Lion's hands, also as if by magic. This led into the line,
I believe there's spooks around here. That's ridiculous. Spooks.
The sequence explains why in the final film, the witch remover spray and butterfly net disappear without any explanation whatsoever. Soon after, and perhaps the most infamous scene this preview audience saw, was the jitterbug sequence. It involved a creature known as the jitterbug, which was sent by the witch to slow down the group.
I've sent a little insect on ahead to take the fight out of them.
The catch is that whoever the bug bites, which was to be fully animated, causes said person to break out into dance. This elaborate musical number was filmed over the course of 4 days, and was expected to be a major highlight of the movie. It was also done at the cost of around $80,000, or $1.4 million today, which made it one of the most expensive sequences in the entire film. Moving on, there was a bit more dialogue with putting the Scarecrow back together, Toto's escape from the castle, the fight with the guards, and Dorothy's escape. One of the more significant portions was also a reprise of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, when Dorothy's locked away in the witch's tower. It was a much more somber and sad iteration of the song, with Judy Garland giving a very heartfelt and emotional performance. There was also originally one final musical number, with a reprise of Hail, Hail, the Witch is Dead, known as the Triumphal Return. You see, after Dorothy kills the Wicked Witch, there was more dialogue with the Winkies, which led to her receiving the witch's broom. This transitioned to a scene where the citizens of Oz celebrated Dorothy and her friend's return, with an elaborate musical number. The sequence is estimated to have cost $100,000, or just over $1.5 million today, and was a nice way to bookend the film. Once his true identity is revealed, there was also quite a bit more back and forth with the Wizard of Oz, which emphasized their disappointment and shock. Finally, though not necessarily a scene itself, there was a montage that played while Dorothy clicks her heels and returns back to Kansas. It's also worth mentioning that there was much more dialogue from the Wicked Witch, which often made her character even more terrifying. In fact, if you know where to look, most of everything we've discussed is easy to spot in the final film due to jarring jump cuts.
I can cause accidents too. Aren't you forgetting the ruby slippers?
I can cause accidents too. Aren't you forgetting the ruby slippers?
Now, even though the sequence was the most expensive within the entire film to shoot, after the first round of previews, the Jitterbug musical number was cut. The true reason behind its removal is a bit of a mystery, as more than one reason was given by those involved. One is that the filmmakers felt it ruined the established dramatic tension, as the sequence took place between the terrifying first encounter with Oz and all the dramatic scenes at the witch's castle. Another is that the name Jitterbug was a term given to a certain style of dancing, and they wanted to avoid dating the film. Either way, the first preview is also when the extended Scarecrow sequence was cut, as it was viewed as a bit too fanciful and unessential to the rest of the scene. The movie was cut down even further after another preview on June 16th, at the Pomona Fox Theater in Los Angeles, California. This included some of the more frightening moments having to do with the Wicked Witch, as a columnist who attended the preview reported it was far too scary for kids. One particular excision was met with a ton of controversy, as after this same preview, Somewhere Over the Rainbow was taken out of the film. It's important to stress that the sequence wasn't almost removed, but physically cut from the print intended for the next preview. Not one, not two, but 6 MGM executives argued it slowed down the movie, and thought the notion of Judy Garland performing a musical number in a barnyard was distasteful. To get Somewhere Over the Rainbow back in the picture, the film's producers Mervyn LeRoy and Arthur Freed gave an ultimatum: the song stays, or we go. Not wanting to lose either of them, MGM head honcho Louis B. Mayer overrode all the other executives to allow it back in the film, or in his own words, quote, "Let the boys have the damn song. Put it back in the picture. It can't hurt." The final preview for the movie was held on June 27th in San Luis Obispo, which resulted in additional cuts such as Hickory's Wind Machine and miscellaneous lines of dialogue. It's also possibly the last time the triumphal return sequence was ever seen by the public, as after this screening, it was cut to shorten the film's runtime even further. The last-minute removal is why the scene was still used in promotional material, such as lobby cards and even trailers. This brought the film down to 101 minutes, with 20 or so minutes left on the cutting room floor, and the rest of production was wrapped within a matter of weeks. All told, the entire production cost of The Wizard of Oz was a whopping $2.8 million, which was $1 million over budget, becoming one of the most expensive movies ever made. This put a lot of pressure on the film's prospective box office returns, so MGM did everything in their power to make The Wizard of Oz an event film. Promotion for Oz was plastered in virtually every news and film magazine available, featuring interviews with the cast and crew, as well as publicity photos. One of the more unique examples was an elaborate float within the Rose Parade in Pasadena, California, which was attended by over 1 million people. Ahead of its release, they also sent Judy Garland and child star Mickey Rooney to New York City as part of a promotional tour for the film.
Oh, Mr. Mayor, that looks like we're going to move in. You bet a lot. You move in, you tell the kids, hey, what do you think of this fair? Isn't it great? It's really wonderful. Isn't it fine?
But this was more than just a typical promotional tour, as they were both integral to The Wizard of Oz's official release on August 25th at the Capitol Theater. You see, after the showing of the film, they were to perform a special half-hour musical show to theatergoers, with a full 20-piece orchestra. On opening day, over 15,000 people lined up in the streets, which cemented The Wizard of Oz as one of the largest movie openings in history. Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney would actually continue this after-show special for another 2 weeks, with 5 performances a day on weekdays and 7 on weekends. Now, despite popular belief, The Wizard of Oz was incredibly well received all over the country, with both audiences and critics giving the film overwhelming praise. Although some criticized the movie for being too scary for kids, The Wicked Witch in particular, and for Judy Garland being a bit too old to play Dorothy. In fact, one of the only truly negative reviews was by Russell Maloney of The New Yorker, who said that the film had no trace of imagination, good taste, or ingenuity, and was, quote, a stinkeroo. But while the movie was adored by many, it failed in terms of making a profit, and wound up actually losing money. Part of this had to do with the movie's distribution and elaborate marketing campaign, which brought the movie's total cost to roughly $3.8 million. Another reason for the movie's financial troubles was the fact that the vast majority of tickets being sold weren't for adults, but for children. True, they would see the film over and over, but their price of admission was just a fraction of those for adults, which was reflected in its revenue. There was also the problem with movie theaters at the time, as most were owned by major film studios who forced theater owners to carry their films. So, let's say The Wizard of Oz was doing fantastic at a theater owned by Warner Brothers. Well, after 2 weeks, theater owners were often forced to replace it with the newest Warner Brothers picture. The final reason for Oz's lackluster box office was the beginning of World War II just 1 month into its release, and propaganda films took center stage. That said, the film did manage to have a fairly wide international release, but this was also severely impacted by the war, both in terms of distribution and ticket sales. In the end, its box office earnings were just over $3 million, so all told, The Wizard of Oz's financial loss was nearly $1 million. But even though the movie failed to break even, executives at MGM were still very pleased, as they believed that through re-releases in the future, Oz would be able to return a profit down the road.
Members of the Academy, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, it's my privilege this year to present that award for the outstanding performance by a juvenile actress during the past year, Miss Judy Garland.
In addition to Judy Garland's Oscar for Outstanding Performance by a Juvenile Actress, The Wizard of Oz was ultimately nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Unfortunately, the movie had the disadvantage of going up against Gone with the Wind, which received a record 13 nominations and was the highest-grossing film of all time. That said, The Wizard of Oz took home the Oscar for Best Original Musical Score, and another for Best Original Song, which of course was for Somewhere Over the Rainbow. The irony is that Victor Fleming did win an Oscar for Best Director, however not for The Wizard of Oz, but Gone with the Wind. Now, as hard as it is to believe, after Hollywood's celebration of Oz's monumental achievement, the movie's popularity faded away rather quickly. Keep in mind, this was well before the advent of home video, so once a movie ran its course in theaters, that was pretty much it. The one exception were theatrical re-releases, the first of which for The Wizard of Oz was a full decade later in 1949. Its reissue earned a respectable $1.5 million. So even though it took a full decade, Oz finally broke even. But not by much. Although it did have one of the strangest movie trailers ever, which tried to appeal to adults in a way that hasn't aged well. With Judy Garland's Academy Award nomination for A Star is Born in 1955, there was another re-release of Oz that same year. But this time the movie wound up grossing just $500,000, and was considered a disappointment by MGM. However, by sheer coincidence, another form of entertainment was rising fast in popularity, and helped turn The Wizard of Oz into the legend it is today. You see, by 1956, Hollywood was finally embracing a once laughable idea: broadcasting their films on television to the public for free. For years they'd held on to the belief that the growing new medium was an inferior form of entertainment, and had a genuine fear this could mean the death of cinema. In fact, this fear is what led to the development of VistaVision and CinemaScope, which were the first widescreen film formats adopted by the industry. It was done explicitly as an effort to combat the rise of free television entertainment, a way to convince the public the theater-going experience was far superior. But once studios made the realization that television was here to stay, they began to embrace it, by licensing their film libraries to various networks. One such studio was MGM, who began to license their films made prior to 1949 as part of various packages. This is what led to the network CBS to inquire about licensing their crown jewels, Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. As a quick FYI, MGM had acquired Gone with the Wind in the 40s, so by this point they owned all distribution and licensing rights. Even 20 years later, Gone with the Wind was still the highest-grossing film of all time, with the most Academy Awards nominations to boot. In regards to CBS's request to license Gone with the Wind, MGM said no, as they felt the movie was far too prestigious to be allowed on TV. But given The Wizard of Oz's disappointing box office returns the year prior, they decided to experiment with allowing this on TV. So CBS paid a staggering $250,000 for the rights to broadcast The Wizard of Oz, which took place on November 3, 1956. Oz was seen on TV for the first time by over 45 million people, or just over 50% of those watching television that night. The next broadcast for The Wizard of Oz was in 1959, and drew in even more viewers than before, nearly 60% of those watching television that night. This began a tradition millions of Americans looked forward to each year, and introduced a whole new generation to the magic and wonder of The Wizard of Oz. Keep in mind, these once-a-year broadcasts were practically the only way to see the movie, as its home video release was over 20 years away. Although it is worth mentioning that when CBS's contract expired, NBC picked up the rights in their place, but this time at a whopping $1 million per broadcast. The most somber of these broadcasts was on March 15, 1970, which celebrated the life of Judy Garland, who'd passed away a year prior.
Judy Garland's daughter, Liza Minnelli, had requested that her mother's funeral be held in as dignified a manner as possible. Apparently, she's getting her wish. Some of the thousands of people who came today have been standing on line for hours, but they were quiet, orderly, respectful.
The next major milestone of The Wizard of Oz was its release on the new medium of home video in 1980, on both Betamax and VHS. From the 1980s onward, Oz's popularity only grew through additional theatrical releases, new home video formats, and of course all the other adaptations of the beloved books. Although, fun fact, in 1981, there was a very loose adaptation of the original film's making called Under the Rainbow, starring Carrie Fisher and Chevy Chase. A large portion revolves around the actors portraying the Munchkins off-set, which shows them, according to the urban legend, that they were absolute hellraisers. Of course, this has since been proven to be mostly made up, with a select few mischievous and drunken actors lending to this myth, so the film is problematic to say the least, and pretty cringy. But if you're wondering about the 20 minutes or so of cutscenes mentioned earlier, sadly, they'll probably never be seen again. This is also the case with Richard Thorpe's footage, which features a blonde Dorothy Gale, Buddy Ebsen as the Tin Man, and the original Wicked Witch. Even if by some miracle it was not destroyed after the film's release, as was often the case back then, it almost certainly was in 1965. Long story short, this is when a fire broke out within MGM's Vault No. 7, and as rumor has it, contained at least some of the cut footage. If the footage wasn't in the vault, its last fighting chance at survival was extinguished in the 1970s. You see, this is when MGM hauled much of its Technicolor flammable nitrate film stock to the Pacific Ocean, and dumped it into the water. But it wasn't just film footage, as MGM also decided to purge its archives of props, set pieces, matte paintings, etc. A specific example is this matte painting, which was literally thrown into a dumpster and rescued by a film historian who heard about what they were doing. But as for me, I'd like to remain optimistic, because if The Wizard of Oz was able to come to fruition despite all the forces working against it, well, maybe the footage is out there, somewhere over a metaphorical rainbow.